The morning sun hung high in the sky over London, its pale, golden light stretching across the cobblestone streets, reflecting off the mysterious black iron railings of Buckingham Palace. Tourists from all over the world gathered in small groups. Some quietly admired the grandeur of the palace, while others took photos with the royal guards in their deep red uniforms and towering bearskin hats. Beside the crowd, patiently observing the changing of the guard, a voice rang out, piercing the solemn atmosphere like thunder. "Hey, look at that! A whole army of dolls on display in the street. How ridiculous! Are you still doing these silly acts in this day and age?" Brandon Carter appeared like a streak of light, out of place in the crowd. His expensive sunglasses hid his eyes, his hair was neatly combed, and his polo shirt was ironed perfectly. On his head, a red hat with the words "America First" shone brightly like a declaration of war against the surrounding space. Next to him, Ethan Brooks looked more reserved, his posture slightly closed off as though he did not fully agree with his friend's approach. Brandon smirked, gripping his phone tightly, the camera aimed straight at the guard. The video was being streamed live on social media, where thousands of his followers were commenting enthusiastically. "Hello, my fans. This is exactly what I'm talking about. We, America, are leading the world, while England is still stuck with these meaningless performances. See that? They stand still like wax figures, doing nothing but wasting taxpayer money. Meanwhile, in America, our military actually fights, not just well to pose for photos for tourists." He laughed loudly, enjoying the surge in viewership. Several comments appeared on the phone screen. "Red circle, so true. The British royal family is just a living relic. Red circle, ha, let's see if you can make one of those scarecrows move." Brandon sneered. "A challenge? That sounded interesting." He took a step forward, staring directly at the guard before him. The soldier's eyes remained fixed, not a blink, his stance firm like an impregnable fortress. On his chest, the brass buttons glistened in the early morning light, like tiny flames that never went out. But Brandon did not see the resilience in that silence. He only saw an opportunity to provoke. Brandon did not stop there. Each of his words was like a strike against the silent wall of Buckingham, a wall he considered to be something outdated and with no place in the modern world. He took a few more steps, his eyes never leaving the guard, his provocative words like a performance for his virtual audience. Although aware that he was drawing attention, he did not feel the tension in the air around him. Instead, he felt pride radiating from each word he spoke. "Do you see that? That's what Trump is talking about. We don't need these ceremonial games. These soldiers, what royalty? They just stand there like old statues, while our military is actually doing important work, protecting the country, protecting freedom." He spoke, turning his head to the camera, his eyes lighting up as he saw his viewership surge. Brandon began to feel as though he was leading a revolution right there. He felt powerful, like the stars in the videos he watched on social media, the ones who always had influence, always had a voice. But in that moment, something changed within him, an indescribable feeling, like a broken breath in the quiet space. The guard's gaze, although unchanged, seemed to challenge him. A challenge that he couldn't fully understand at first, but it made him feel bound to it. Brandon took a few more steps, now only a few meters away from the guard. The sense of power inside him surged, and he couldn't resist the temptation to harm what he saw as a symbol of outdated tradition. He slightly curled his lips, preparing to continue his attack, even attempting to wave the American flag right in front of the guard, as though that was his way of showing power, superiority. "You just stand there and waste resources. Who do you think you are? While Trump is rebuilding the country, you're just standing here playing theater. There is nothing real here. Everything is just a flashy display for people to look at. We need action, not theory. How can you lead while clinging to traditions like this?" His words flew out of his mouth like arrows, full of anger and contempt. But at that moment, something Brandon never imagined happened. Suddenly, a voice rang out, not from the crowd, but from the guard standing before him. "Mr. Carter." Brandon felt as though he was cut off in the middle of space. He turned, his gaze locked with the guard's. His own name, called out by someone he had considered invisible. The feeling of being seen through made him momentarily feel short of breath. Before he could react, the guard continued, his voice calm, yet sharp like a cold blade. You said we're just standing here as decoration, that we're just statues. But I hope you understand that these soldiers, we are not statues. We are people who have fought alongside American comrades in wars that not everyone can fully understand. Brandon stood stunned. The voice was not loud, not powerful, but it was like a deep undercurrent pulling him into a different world, a world he had never known. The calmness of the guard made his words seem meaningless, like the fake stories he had heard on social media. He felt something being defeated within his mind, but he didn't want to admit it. The guard continued, unaffected by the anger and disdain in Brandon's eyes. You talk about the American military, but have you ever heard the story of the British soldiers who stood strong in the greatest battles of history? These soldiers, whom you are mocking, have been the protectors of freedom long before freedom became a slogan. We don't need to prove that to anyone, because we've done what needed to be done. Brandon felt as though he had been pushed out of the conversation, as if his words had no value. The space around him began to change, shifting from anger and mocking laughter to a heavy silence. The crowd was no longer sarcastic. Instead, there was a threatening quiet. Brandon felt suffocated, the air closing in on him, unable to escape. Ethan, his friend who had been with him, finally spoke up, his voice soft but hesitant. Brandon, stop. Not anymore. The name Brandon, called out by the guard, struck like a lightning bolt, splitting the air. A moment of silence followed, and in that instant, everything around Brandon seemed to freeze. The words he had just uttered suddenly became meaningless, like a play without an audience, a game no one cared to join. Mr. Carter, the soldier's voice continued, cold and firm. You said we are nothing but statues, that we do nothing but stand here. But I believe you may not fully understand who we are. Brandon stood motionless, unable to speak. He struggled to control the rising sense of confusion in his chest, but could not deny that a truth was beginning to pierce through his thoughts. This soldier did not merely stand there like a statue. He was a person, a true warrior, and his calm demeanor was slowly breaking through Brandon's arrogant shell. We do not stand here just for show, the guard continued, his gaze unwavering. We are people who have fought in wars that not everyone can understand. Do you know, we fought alongside American comrades, faced the enemy without a moment's rest, without a call for backup? Brandon could not believe what he was hearing. He turned his head to look at the crowd silently watching. Their gazes had changed, no longer filled with admiration or encouragement, but with deep silence, as if waiting for something greater, a truth Brandon had never considered. You speak of the strength of the American military, the soldier continued, his voice calm, but full of depth. But I have fought alongside SEALs, and they understand that strength does not come from weapons or empty slogans. True strength lies in discipline, perseverance, and the values we protect, not to make a game of it, but to maintain freedom for all. The words hit Brandon like a cold wind through his heart, making him feel as though he were being drowned in his own words. He wanted to retort, to prove he was right, but part of him recognized that there was something deeper than what he had imagined, something he had never understood. You said we stand here like statues, the guard continued, now his gaze sharp as a blade. But do you know that we stood firm in battles with nothing but courage and discipline? These soldiers, whom you mock, fought in wars, sacrificed not just for this country, but for freedom and human rights. Brandon stood still, his hand gripping his phone tightly as if to hold onto his last defense. But inside, unease began to stir, like an unquenchable fire that could not be extinguished. He began to feel his own weakness. It wasn't the soldier before him, but himself, in the world he had built in his mind, where everything had to follow Trump's rules, where only grand gestures were valued, and everything else was just show. Part of Brandon wanted to turn and walk away, but he could not. He had come too far to easily give up. His ego, the arrogance of someone who always believed he had the right to criticize everything, now turned against him. Ethan stood beside him, looking at Brandon with eyes that no longer held admiration, only silence, his eyes filled with deep disappointment. Ethan did not speak, but within him, shame began to rise. He had seen the change in Brandon and could not admit that the friend he trusted could be so wrong. The guard did not stop. He continued, as if everything Brandon had said were mere, meaningless waves fading away. You speak of the strength of the American military. But let me ask you, have you ever witnessed a soldier standing there, enduring in silence, for a reason greater than themselves? Do you know that these soldiers stood here, not because they had to, but because they had built their resolve over many years to protect what is most valuable, without needing anyone to praise them? Brandon felt something inside him shatter, as if the world he had built for so long was collapsing. The guard's words were no longer theoretical. They were sincere, words he felt he could not deny. He wanted to argue, but could not find any words strong enough to defend himself. He no longer had the confidence to continue this fight. We stand here not for show. We stand here for a reason deeper than anything you've said. To remember that there are things worth protecting, no matter how the world may change. Silence. No more words to argue. The crowd was silent too. All eyes were on Brandon, but not with admiration, but with curiosity, doubt, and disappointment. Brandon stood frozen, feeling as though the entire world was shrinking around him, trapping him in a cocoon from which there was no escape. The words of the guard were like large stones smashing into his head. Each sentence, each word, digging deep into his heart as if they had pierced through every layer of his mental defenses. But in that moment, Brandon's pride surged. He could not accept that he was wrong, that the values he had held on to for so long were being challenged by a soldier who said little but possessed real strength. The feeling of being pushed into a vulnerable position angered him, like an animal cornered with no choice but to bite back. I am not wrong, Brandon thought, his self-respect burning inside him. This is just outdated tradition they refuse to let go of. They don't understand the true power of America, the power of a nation not constrained by meaningless rituals. He felt a wave of anger overpower his reason as the soldier's words hammered into his mind like continuous blows. The shame, the feeling of being unable to stand firm in this confrontation, of not allowing others to see his weakness, only made him more determined. He could not let himself be defeated by a silent soldier who had said nothing but still managed to bewilder him. His eyes flashed with a fierce light, a light of defiance, of a new strategy he had just thought up. How much longer can you protect these traditions? He snapped back, but this time, it wasn't just a retort, it was an attempt to regain control of his narrative. I don't deny that you've sacrificed, but let me tell you, if you stay stuck in the past, you'll never move forward. How long can you stand here? How long can you continue defending an empire that has been decaying for years? Brandon took a step forward, but this time not to attack, rather to stand face to face with the soldier as a challenge for him to react. Deep down, Brandon knew he couldn't win this confrontation, but his arrogance wouldn't allow him to quit. Ethan, standing beside him, looked at Brandon with disappointment in his eyes. He could clearly feel the change in his friend. At first, Brandon seemed so confident, but now he was only trying to hide the confusion and fear inside him. Ethan couldn't believe how blindly Brandon was acting. He sighed, a sense of shame rising in his chest. He knew that Brandon wasn't a bad person, but his words had crossed the line of respect and understanding. Brandon, stop, Ethan said, his voice deepening, but it was too late. He had already known that Brandon wouldn't listen, for in that moment, Brandon was no longer himself. He was no longer the friend Ethan knew. He was someone else, a figure lost in a battle with himself and the values he believed in. The guard remained unchanged. He stood tall, his eyes unwavering, not showing any sign of frustration or anger. His calmness was like an unshakable mountain, implacable. He turned slowly, not hurriedly, but with a chilling composure, beginning to speak again. You talk about defending an empire and tradition, the soldier said. But I want you to understand one thing. Our traditions are not about rituals to draw attention, but about respect for those who have sacrificed to protect true values. His voice was soft, yet carried a strength that Brandon could not ignore. So, To you, what is strength? Is it the power to impose, to bring others down simply because we have louder voices? Or is it the strength to stand firm, unyielding to any criticism, to defend what truly deserves to be protected? Brandon didn't answer immediately, but a sense of crisis began to grow inside him. The soldier's words were not just a rebuttal, but a warning. He understood that he was standing in a place where any word or action could lead him to consequences he couldn't even imagine. Each word of the soldier felt like a cold blade cutting deeply into the beliefs Brandon had built up over the years. But what was more frightening was that Brandon began to feel a sensation he had never encountered before. A slow sense of regret spread through his heart, but he didn't want to admit it. He wanted to protect his dignity, protect his ego. He wanted to speak back, to continue fighting. But deep down, he knew that this battle was not about what he could win, but about accepting the truth that he was wrong. The more he thought, the more confusion grew within Brandon. He was no longer sure what he was fighting for. What he had once considered truth was now shattering before his eyes, piece by piece. He wanted to resist, but then didn't know what to say. The soldier's words, sure, unwavering, but so gentle, had penetrated into him, filling the spaces he had never seen within himself. Brandon stood there, unable to move, unable to respond, as if the world around him had separated from himself. The silence enveloped him, like a thick fog, making every passing second feel more suffocating. Each time he opened his mouth to resist, a part of him reminded him that his words no longer held any value. The sense of defeat did not only come from the guard, but from within himself. It was the feeling that everything he had once believed in had been shattered in the face of the resilience of a single person. The crowd around him began to sigh, their gazes no longer filled with doubt, but shifting to disappointment, as if they had seen enough, heard enough of Brandon's arrogant words, and now it was time to watch him confront the undeniable truth. Every eye was focused on Brandon, like a silent judgment. Ethan looked at his friend, his heart filled with sorrow. He knew that the friend he once considered strong was now sinking into a mire of regret, but he didn't know how to save him. Ethan understood that this was not the first time Brandon had faced failure, but this time, the defeat did not come from a battle or an external challenge. It came from within him, from facing mistakes he could no longer deny. While Brandon remained there, his mind spinning, the guard continued to remain silent, standing still with an immovable posture, but with a strength that Brandon could not deny. It was not because the guard controlled the conversation, but because of the respect and discipline that this soldier embodied. For a moment, Brandon felt as though he was being taught a profound lesson in honor, something he had never truly understood until confronted with it. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a sound that made Brandon flinch. A tomato flew out of nowhere and hit him directly. In an instant, it burst on his shirt, soaking into the fabric with the bright red juice. The feeling of embarrassment hit him hard, but the anger inside him did not subside. He quickly turned around, scanning the crowd, and realized that the people no longer looked at him with curiosity or admiration. Those who were watching him were now laughing at him. The crowd, from the tourists to the locals, was mocking him, and in that moment, Brandon felt like a fool. He had never imagined he could end up in such a situation, never thought he could become the target of such public ridicule. But now, he was no longer a leader or a winner in the eyes of the crowd. He was a failure, defeated by himself. Brandon began to step back, each step slow, as if he were trying to escape the pit of shame. But it was not an escape. It was the acknowledgement that he could no longer stand firm. He raised his hand, trying to wipe his face, but only splattered the tomato juice onto his hands, intensifying the embarrassment he felt inside. Another laugh echoed, not from the crowd, but from Ethan, the only true friend Brandon had. But Ethan's laugh was not mocking, not filled with contempt. It was a soft, bittersweet laugh, as if he had realized that his friend had lost his way too far, and now there was only emptiness left. "I can't help you anymore," Ethan thought to himself, but he could not say it. For even Ethan didn't know what he could do to pull Brandon out of this self-destructive spiral. Brandon continued to step back, but no longer with the same proud energy. The MAGA hat on his head seemed to have lost all meaning. Though he still tried to maintain a strong gaze, deep down, he realized that everything he had fought for was now falling apart. The wall he had built throughout his life had crumbled, and standing before him was a soldier with true value that he could not deny. "Trump will hear about this," Brandon said, but his voice no longer held the same certainty as before. "Trump will understand me." But even he did not believe those words anymore. In reality, Brandon felt like he was no longer himself, and within him, the fear of facing undeniable truths was rising. Finally, in a moment of unexpected and almost shameful closure, an egg flew toward Brandon. He could not avoid it, and it broke right in front of him, covering his face with a layer of golden yolk, like a cruel ending to the journey of a person who could not accept his own mistakes. Brandon's humiliation did not come only from the crowd laughing at him, but from the fact that he could not face himself. The entire crowd, from the English-speaking people to the international tourists, witnessed the moment when he had to confront the obvious truth that his arrogance was nothing more than a fragile shell, unable to protect him when faced with true resilience and honor. Brandon stood there, amidst the crowd whispering and pointing, trying to gather the shattered pieces of his self-respect. He looked down at his expensive shoes now dirty, the shirt stained with splashes of red from tomatoes and yellow from eggs. An expensive outfit that had failed to protect him from this humiliation, and the feeling of loss began to pull him into an inner storm. He tried to adjust the MAGA hat on his head, but it no longer resembled a symbol of power. It was just a cheap ornament discarded amidst anger and regret. The crowd seemed to have reached the peak of their criticism and disdain, and Brandon realized that he was no longer a part of them. He could not feel any empathy or respect from those around him, no longer any respectful glances from the tourists, no more encouraging applause as before. Everyone had turned their backs on him, and in that moment, Brandon felt a cold loneliness as never before. The feeling of humiliation intensified when Ethan turned to him, with no trace of sympathy in his eyes. Ethan felt not only Brandon's failure, but also his own. He had come with his friend, believing that Brandon would prove to everyone the strength of freedom and American power. But now, he only saw a friend who had lost his way. Brandon's pride had completely vanished, and now, he was just a broken piece beyond repair. The guard remained still, without a single change in his posture. His hair gently swayed in the morning breeze, his eyes still calm and stern. But now, those eyes seemed to hold a deep understanding that Brandon could never grasp. The soldier did not look at Brandon with a victorious gaze, but with one of respect. It was a look Brandon could not find in the eyes of Trump supporters. It was the look of someone who had fought for what they believed in, without the need to flaunt or prove who they were. That was real strength, not in words, but in actions. Brandon slowly lifted his head, his eyes meeting the soldiers, but no longer with arrogance or defiance. He saw the resolve in the soldier's gaze, saw the calm he had never had, and a feeling he had never understood, respect for long-held values, for sacrifice that required no recognition, for a strength that did not need to speak. "I think I understand now," Brandon said, his voice no longer loud or confident, but soft, filled with contemplation. "But there's still one question. Why do you still do this? Why do you still defend a system that many consider outdated?" The guard simply stood there, but his silence carried an answer more powerful than any words. He looked at Brandon once more, his deep eyes not to answer his question, but to make him understand that sometimes not every action needs an explanation. "We do not protect a system," the guard said. "We protect a belief in respect, in loyalty, and in what truly holds value in this life." Brandon felt a change inside him, like a layer of armor being peeled away. He didn't fully understand everything the soldier had said, but those words were making him start to reflect on himself. He remembered the things he had said earlier, the words that had shattered a deep respect he had never considered. I'm sorry," Brandon said, words he never thought he would say. "I didn't understand. I was wrong." Ethan stood beside him, saying nothing, He just looked at Brandon as if he finally understood that this was not a story about politics or power. It was a story about humility, about facing mistakes that cannot be undone. And in this moment, Ethan also realized that he could have understood this lesson a long time ago, but he chose to overlook it. The crowd had lost interest in them. Everyone had returned to their own lives, and like a gentle, silent wave, the attention no longer focused on Brandon. He still stood there, full of regret and contemplation. But he understood that this change could not come in a single moment. It was a long journey, an understanding that had to continue over time. And so, Brandon walked away, not with pride, but with a newfound humility in his heart. His ego no longer pushed him forward, and now he walked a different path, one he could not see before. It was the path of acceptance, of respect, and of a valuable lesson about true strength. True strength is not in loud words or rushed actions. It comes from patience, from the humility to face mistakes and learn from them. Only when we can recognize the value of respect and resilience in every action do we truly understand the strength within ourselves.